Thanks for taking the time this evening for an important talk about Afghanistan, what's happening now, and how the US has shaped these conditions through their ongoing war for imperial expansion. The US's war in and occupation of Afghanistan is among the longest, if not the longest, sustained military action in our history. Beginning as a supposed response to events of September 11th, the US invaded Afghanistan on October 7th, 2001, and has remained there to this day. What has the war and occupation meant to the people of Afghanistan? How has the US involvement affected social and economic conditions throughout the country? What has the prolonged US involvement in establishing the Afghan government meant for the people of Afghanistan? And how are things likely to go with the new peace agreement brokered in February? A world away and distracted by our own political and social emergencies, we can sometimes forget what's being done in our name, as nearly 2 decades of US military actions erode the infrastructure and the morale of the people. And of course, even while dealing with all of these other critical conditions, Afghanistan, like every other country on the planet, is having to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. How are they doing in the face of this global health crisis? Dr. Hakim, who works with the Afghan peace volunteers in Afghanistan, recently wrote, during Afghanistan's lockdown, angry and hungry folk in Ghor province protested that corrupt government officials had redirected foreign food aid to themselves. They clashed with the police. 7 persons were killed. During Minneapolis lockdown, George Floyd was stopped, and under the forceful knee of a policeman, he was suffocated and killed. Like the people of Ghor, the people of the US are braving the virus to protest. That's right, the people of the US and the people of Afghanistan have this in common: to move forward, demanding liberation from corrupt governments and demanding a world based in justice and peace. How can we do this together? How can the people of the US support this effort in Afghanistan? As Americans and as people of conscience, we are obligated to learn answers to these questions. And we are obligated to stand up and say, no, not in our name. Professor Wahab speaks with us this evening. He's an Afghan American who taught at Lewis and Clark College for 4 decades before teaching at the American University in Afghanistan for 6 years. That ended in 2019. Frequently visiting the country before that, he witnessed the US occupation over the 18+ years it has been happening. Now he's back in Portland, and we are honored to have him with us this evening.
I was born and raised in Afghanistan and then educated in Lebanon, New York, and California. And I have lived here for many, many decades, but I've gone back all this time. The last 18 years, I have gone back every year to work with the Afghan Ministry of Higher Education and Kabul Education University. For the last 6 years, I worked and taught and stayed at the American University of Afghanistan. And I can say that we were under complete lockdown for about 6 years. So in some ways, I have rehearsed the quarantine and being locked down. I am currently, of course, a US citizen, so this is my adopted country, but my country of origin was Afghanistan. And I speak both of the national official languages in Afghanistan, Dari and Pashto. So first, some realities of Afghan life. Afghanistan is a very complicated and very heterogeneous society. One of the first things that you can see is actually enormous tension, either overt or covert ethnic tension. There are many, many different ethno-racial groups living in Afghanistan. Although a couple of them, the Tajiks, Pashtuns, Hazaras, Uzbeks, seem to be more dominant, and they occupy most positions of power. And they're the ones who sort of struggle for power, resources, glory, and so forth. And this diversity has sort of complicated even governance. Because the last 5 years we had what we called a national unity government, where after the presidential election, there was sort of a stalemate, and John Kerry, then the Secretary of State, went there and sort of patched up a solution and made Dr. Ashraf Ghani as the president of Afghanistan, and his challenger, Dr. Abdullah, as the chief executive officer. This position was carved by John Kerry, although not in the Constitution or so. And it was very apparent that from day one, these two gentlemen were at odds. Of course, they had competed against each other. They really did not like each other and didn't get along. And so in the last 5 years, very little was done by the so-called national unity government. We had the second election last September, where the two gentlemen again were the dominant candidates, and the results were declared in February, where Dr. Ghani was declared the president and Abdullah the runner-up. And so there was a lot of argument and protracted negotiations for months and months. And finally, toward the end of February, Ashraf Ghani was recognized as the president, and Abdullah was given a title of the chairman of the High Council for National Reconciliation. The election, as I said, took place on September 23rd, and the cabinets have not yet been formed, in part because of the ethnic rivalries and ethnic tensions. In fact, when the inauguration took place, there were two presidential inaugurations just a few hundred yards from each other at the very same time. So ethnicity and ethnic tensions are one reality and one serious problem. Second, the existence of warlords. The United States occupation and invasion led to the creation of many, many warlords. Religious people, non-religious, secular, inside the government, outside the government. And these warlords have enormous power because through, again, their access to the occupation forces and access to the government, they accumulated a lot of wealth. And actually some of them have their own militias and prison systems. And these warlords, again, come from different groups, and they too are always struggling for power. Then there are the different mafias, national mafias connected to the international mafias. You know, there's the land mafia, the timber mafia, the foreign aid mafia, the marble mafia, the gold mafia, the charcoal mafia, and different kinds of mafias that monopolize contracts and also the resources in the country. In fact, some of these mafias are very active excavating mines, and the government has no control over them. And then the other problem is the enormous tension between what I call the secular segment and also the traditional religious sector. There's not just one Afghanistan, but actually several Afghanistans. City people are quite different in their lifestyle, their perspective, education, insights, entertainment, et cetera, from the country people. You can say that the country people, by and large, who live off and on the land, still live almost in the 18th century. So every time there is a discussion about even school curriculum, this tension between the modern and traditional sectors come to the surface. Next is the existence not just of the Taliban as an insurgent group, but also there are 18 other insurgent groups, the ISIS, the Qaeda, the Daesh, and many other small and large groups, some of them with direct connections with foreign governments. And then Afghanistan is desperately poor by any measure, whether it's lifespan, literacy, doctors per 1,000 people, per capita income, health indicators, and other indicators, women's rights and so forth, employment, food, calorie intake. This is one of the poorest countries in the world. Next is the foreign meddling. There's obviously enormous foreign meddling. Right now, there are troops from not just the United States, but also from 43 other countries. There are an estimated 16,000 troops, but also for them, for every troop level, there is a contractor who could be from Afghanistan or one of these other countries or from so-called third countries. The next problem is the reality is the drug industry. Afghanistan just produced 7,000 tons of opium this year. It's about $5 to $6 billion a year, local price, but internationally, apparently it reaches 70 to 80 billion dollars. The drug industry has created about 3 million addicts. And when you walk around the cities or even in the villages, you can see drug addicts passed out or try to make some kind of a living. This is a very serious problem because it has affected all levels of society and all segments of society, and it has sort of deformed the economy. And then there's the problem of corruption. There was a report just out today, actually, by the Integrity Watch, saying Afghanistan continues to be the most corrupt country in the world. Afghans paid between $1.5 to $2 billion in bribes this last year to government officials. So corruption is a problem, whether you're at a university, a hospital, a school, a government office, talking to the traffic police, whatever you are, there's sort of a price, and you can purchase your way in and out of things if you pay the money. With it, of course, goes nepotism. That is, in Afghanistan right now, it's very difficult to get anything done, whatever it is, without either paying a bribe or knowing somebody. Crime is another reality. You're not safe in Afghanistan. In your house, in school, at the university, in the hospital, on the way between your house and your workplace, in your shop, if you're traveling, people get abducted or kidnapped in broad daylight, and they ask for ransom, and if you don't pay, it's just too bad, you could be gone. And again, it is being said that this in essence really is a kleptocracy, and where thievery is common, but also the crime, the hardcore, both blue collar and white collar crime. Militarily, the situation is described by American generals actually as either a stalemate or a war lost. It is being said repeatedly, and I will elaborate on this for a minute, that Afghanistan, the Afghan war is the third defeat for the United States, Vietnam and Iraq being the other two. This is the third sort of defeat. There are some 16 to 20,000 fighting soldiers with a lot of air power. The reason we don't hear about American casualties is that their number have been reduced, American and NATO, I should say. But also the invading forces have resorted to air power, airplanes and drones. And so drones are very active day and night, and air power is also very active in the daytime. The Taliban control about half of the country. This is recognized. Everyone says Taliban control half of the attack, half of the country. And so militarily, at one point in 2011, after Obama's surge, we had about 140,000 American troops and quite a few NATO troops. But their number has been reduced to about 16,000 now from 42 odd countries. Militarily, the war continues. It rages very viciously. In fact, even today, there have been bombings, attacks on both sides, from both sides. The fighting is mainly now the Taliban and the government forces and the foreign forces. There are hundreds of attacks every week from both sides. And again, as I said, the insurgents can target hospitals, schools, universities, mosques, homes, shopping centers, even sports events. And every year, it's not just the insurgents and government and foreign troops who are being killed or maimed, but also every year about 3,500 Afghans get killed. It is being said that Afghanistan is the worst place for children and for women, because men can run away, hide, or do something, but women and children are the ones who sort of stay in place, are stuck, and pay the price. Now, so all in all, the situation in Afghanistan from every perspective is so bad that, in fact, I found it very difficult, even though we were quarantined and heavily guarded at the American University of Afghanistan. But we had to go out every so often, of course, in armored cars with escorts and so forth. But the situation was becoming intolerable. And my wife and I, Tamina, we finally said we need a break. How did we get here? Well, you remember the so-called 9/11 crime, and then President George Bush's very quick, impulsive sort of retaliation in October 2001. The United States invaded and occupied Afghanistan in 2001 because bin Laden was in Afghanistan, and the attack, supposedly, the 9/11 atrocity took place because of Afghanistan. But I want to point out, and I talked about this then, that of the 19 hijackers, none were Afghans. 17 were Saudi Arabians and 2 were from other Arab countries. The attack, the training, the planes were all either in Europe, planned in Europe. The training took place in Arizona, and the attack took place here, and there were no Afghans involved. But the US central government decided to penalize sort of the whole country, imposing collective punishment on Afghanistan. And although the President Bush then told us, of course, that he attacked Afghanistan because he wanted to end terrorism, bring progress and democracy to Afghanistan, liberate women, end the narcotics industry, and, as he put it, stabilize not just Afghanistan, but the whole region. Now, subsequently, as you know, and soon thereafter, the other NATO countries and others joined in the effort. In fact, there has been more terrorism, and there are more terrorists in the world, including in this country, and that Afghanistan has not only gone up in development scale, but in fact gone down, according to the think tank Afghan Analyst Network. There's no stability in the region. In fact, the region is highly unstable. So that's the history. You know, instead of dealing with the 9/11 atrocity through legally and through international police, the federal government decided to take care of it by itself, and now we're in this situation where we have pretty much destroyed Afghanistan in every way and made it worse and unlivable, but also the repercussions in the United States are also clearly obvious. Our failure to deal effectively with the pandemic, the inequalities, the poverty, the homelessness, the poor state of education, our infrastructure falling apart, our trade deficit, etc., and the prevalence of violence of all kinds in this country. I think these are, in a way, a mirror of the situation in Afghanistan. So when I say the US and Afghanistan, a fateful partnership, this is what I mean, that this misadventure has been terrible, both for Afghanistan, but also for the United States. So I want to very briefly talk about what some other people have observed and found out regarding this this confrontation, this conflict, or this invasion. You all may have heard last December about the Afghanistan Papers, lessons learned by the Washington Post. The Washington Post spent years studying the situation in Afghanistan and came up with the following. That 62,000 Afghanistan National Security Forces were killed, the security forces. 43,000 civilians were killed, according to the Washington Post. 3,800 contractors, 2,300 US forces, 1,200 NATO forces, some 45,000 Taliban, 424 aid workers, mostly foreigners, 67 media workers, 158 lawyers, and $1 trillion expenses. So the Washington Post Afghan Papers, also titled Lessons Learned, which came out last December, found some of these figures in the costs. In other words, the United States alone has spent at least $1 trillion on the Afghan misadventure. And as I said, there were soldiers from 23, 24 other countries, and of course, they must have spent money too through operations, but also aid. I should also point out at this point that the United States alone has given Afghanistan $130 billion since 2002. 65% of that went to the development of the security forces. The rest of it was so-called development aid. And yet, if you go to Afghanistan, other than a few mansions and skyscrapers and wedding halls and fancy cars and homes, there's very little development to see. Certainly, as I said, the Afghan Analyst Network said that Afghanistan today is, in general, worse off in terms of development than it was in 2001 and 2002. And also, so this was the Washington Post, but another organization that is very important in highly credible, SIGAR, SIGAR, and that is the Special Inspector General for the Afghanistan Reconstruction. Now, it's a congressional, here it is. It's a congressional watchdog group appointed by Congress to sort of trace American money and American conduct in Afghanistan. It's headed by John Sopko, a good man, and there are hundreds of people working for them. And I have heard John Sopko in congressional testimony saying that he was amazed by the hubris, the mendacity, the distortions, and the lies told by the authorities, both military and civilian, in Washington, but also in Kabul. In other words, SIGAR tells us that the American public, the Afghan public, and the world, in fact, have not been told the truth. And what they found out was that no one could really tell, either the military or the civilian in Washington, why they're in Afghanistan, what the goals and objectives are, and whether or not we are making any progress. And you all have heard, of course, John Bolton, who is very much in the news these days, who has a few revelations about Afghanistan. One is about how the president here in Washington still thinks that Karzai is the president of Afghanistan. Apparently, he doesn't know Dr. Ghani, who has been president for 5 years now. He just doesn't know what he's doing, and he's very impulsive. He changes his mind. He doesn't consult, and the military is not telling the truth.